Real quick, before we get started with today's episode, if your counters are covered with tomatoes, cucumbers, green beans, and more, and you're not quite sure what to do with it all, today is your last chance to grab my Harvest to Kitchen course for only $97. You'll get access to over 30 step-by-step videos, plus printable recipes covering how to preserve more than 20 different crops, including tomatoes, green beans, zucchini, cucumbers, even garlic and fresh herbs. Learn how to can, freeze, dehydrate, and store your harvest before it goes to waste. The sale ends tonight, so head to journeywithjill.net/harvest to kitchen and grab it while you can. We'll also put that link in the show notes. Welcome to the Beginner's Garden Podcast, and welcome to September. If there's one month that feels like a juggling act in the garden, it is September. I am hanging on still to a few summer crops, getting some fall crops established, of course, clearing out some beds, and somehow trying to stay on top of it all. The good news, though, we are on the downhill side of the hardest garden work. The cooler weather is coming, and so are the rewards of fall gardening. But there are still a few tasks to keep up with to make the most of this season. Whether you're planting spinach, pruning your tomatoes, or finally pulling out those tired cucumber plants, this list will help you stay focused. And if salad greens are part of your fall garden plans, don't miss out on my free fall salad garden calendar. I'll walk you through exactly what to plant and when so you can harvest fresh greens as long as you can in your climate. You can grab this calendar at the link in the show notes. Now, let's dive into your September garden checklist. The first thing that I want to talk about today is planting. I know it seems like we're on the downhill slide of everything, but this is still a planting month, but you have to be strategic. The first thing that you can be doing, and you'll see this on the free fall calendar, I put this out week by week, is to direct sow greens every other week. When I'm talking about greens, I'm talking about your salad greens, like mesclun greens, which is kind of a lettuce blend, but even more so, more of your brassica greens, your greens mixes, arugula, things like that. I love some of the greens mixes from Johnny's Seeds, Ovation Greens, Elegance Greens, Premium Greens. Those are my favorite because they give quite a bit of a mixture where you get different textures and you get different colors. And the great thing about these greens is that they're not as sensitive to soil temperature. So even if you're still really hot in September, like we are, they're still going to germinate really well. By direct sowing these every other week, you're going to be able to ensure that you have a continual harvest as long as you can. And also the great news about these is that they're very cold hardy. These brassica greens in my garden are typically more cold hardy than even my lettuce greens. So not only will you be able to get them at a succession throughout the fall, but they also may last further into the early winter. This is number one. If you don't do anything else and you love salads, do this every other week. Put it on your calendar. You'll be so glad you did. The second thing is to direct sow spinach. Now, this does kind of depend on where you're located, because if you're far north, this may be a little too late for this. And if you're in far south, you may still have really high soil temperature and they may not germinate very well. But in my area, I'm starting to direct sow spinach about the middle of September. Now, the purpose here is, yes, I would like to get some baby greens before it gets really cold and before the greens stop growing because of the daylight. But more so, I'm looking at direct sowing this spinach to overwinter. I'm in zone 8A. I was 7B for a really long time, and spinach overwinters perfectly well. I've never lost spinach to a winter in probably 10 years of doing my fall garden. The only time I've ever had any damage is like negative degrees, and then the spinach will some of the top growth will die. It'll get too cold, but then it'll regrow and it'll continue. So this spinach that I'm direct sowing, yeah, I'm hoping that I can get it in time and it can grow fast enough for me to get a little bit of a baby green harvest, but more so I'm looking at it toward overwintering. There's nothing like few things growing in the garden in January and February, then you've got some greens overwintering if you live in a zone that allows for that. The next thing to keep planting is lettuce. Now, lettuce is going to be a little bit more picky. Some lettuce varieties are not going to be as cold tolerant as some of the other greens we talked about. And lettuce seeds themselves, I've talked about this before, they're a little bit more picky with soil temperature, so they don't germinate as well in hot soil. And in September, especially early September right now, our soil is still usually a little too hot for lettuce. If I were to direct sow lettuce in the garden, I would probably sow more seeds than usual, because what typically happens if you're sowing a cool season crop in hot soil, you'll still get some of them to germinate, but the germination rate is lower. So you won't get as many of them to sprout in hot soil as you would with soil that's more in the 70s range. That would be more ideal. So what I do to circumnavigate this is I continue starting my lettuce seeds indoors. I like doing this because I have more dependable germination if I'm sowing them indoors. And I really like the final results I get if I'm wanting a larger lettuce plant, whether that's a head or just like a romaine lettuce or whatever. If I'm not just wanting baby greens, but I'm wanting a larger lettuce plant, I like sowing them indoors, and then I like being able to transplant them out where I want them to be. If I'm direct sowing lettuce in, whether that's a square in my raised bed or it's a pocket in my green stalk, I'll usually just scatter lots of seeds in whatever I'm planting in, and then knowing that I'm just going to get a whole bunch of lettuce plants, and then I will harvest them as baby greens. But if I'm transplanting them, I really like doing one lettuce plant per square. I do this in my Garden in Minutes garden grids. They keep them irrigated. I've actually done that all summer. You may have seen the YouTube video on that. But that also allows that one lettuce plant to get really big. And also what I have found is that when you do this with one plant, and then I'd also do this in the green stalk, I forgot to mention this, one plant per pocket, is that when you let that lettuce plant get a little bit larger, depending on the variety, this is more true for romaines, I would say, is you will get a more crisp leaf when it's able to grow a little bit bigger before you harvest it. When you're harvesting baby greens, they tend to be a little bit more tender, which I love that too. But I like the variety of textures. I've learned that I'm getting to be a really picky lettuce salad eater because I like lots of different textures and lots of different colors, and that's the beauty of being able to do this yourself, is you can choose whatever you want and create the salad that you love. All that to say, I do like to start some lettuce indoors still, just to be able to transplant one plant and be able to grow it out for a different purpose than baby lettuce greens. Okay, so that's a lot of talk about greens and salads, but I'm telling you, this is one of my favorite things, maybe my favorite thing in the fall and winter garden, is being able to have my salads all season, all winter. And here's the thing too, is that yes, I have a greenhouse that I do eventually put my lettuce and my greens in, especially as we head into December and January. That's when it starts getting really cold here. But if you choose more cold tolerant varieties of lettuce, even if you don't have a greenhouse, if you cover it with floating row cover, they're going to last longer because they're more winter tolerant. Some of my favorites would be Tango lettuce is a really winter tolerant lettuce, and so is Winter Density, thus the name. And then a new one I'm trying this year, I've heard really good things about, is Rouge de Vert. I'm going to try that one. I've got my cart full of seeds from Botanical Interest where I'm trying some other ones. Another one that I've heard good things about is Ice Queen. Again, I mean, you hear that Ice Queen, what does that tell you? So I'm going to try that one too. So yes, I've got my favorites that I know are solid and they're good for cold, but I'm also, why not try others? Because there may be others that I like as well. Okay, let's move on from salads, because maybe you're not a salad person, or you're like, I get it, Jill. Okay. The next thing you can do is you can transplant fall flowers like pansies, violas, mums are obviously the ones everybody's excited about. But again, in my climate, pansies and violas, if I plant them in the fall, they're beautiful in the fall, but they will overwinter as well. And then they're gorgeous in the early spring. This is something that I've never really made room for flowers as much as I do now, but that I'm looking forward to, obviously, the fall color, but also looking forward to having this in the spring as well. And I've just really enjoyed that. But now's the time to start doing that. And most garden centers are going to have these cool season crops like pansies, violas, and of course, mums. And finally, if you are interested in cover cropping, this is the prime time for most people, no matter what your winter is to sow cover crops in your empty beds that you're not going to be planting fall crops in. Now, one thing I want to caution you about is when you're sowing cover crops in the fall, consider whether they are going to survive your winter. And if they are, consider, do you want this space in the early spring? Because here's what I realized is that when I'm sowing my cover crops, a lot of times they're not going to get very tall. They're going to sprout just enough. They're going to be pretty short. And then they're going to stop growing just like everything else does when it gets too cold and the sunlight's low. But then they don't really start taking off until late January and February, even into March and April. So if you're really wanting the best benefit of these cover crops, either choose a fast-growing crop that you know is going to die over your winter so you have that space to be able to plant in the early spring, or know that you're okay with waiting until later in the spring to have those spaces available if you want to make best use of those cover crops. And that definitely does depend on the crop itself, but I would recommend doing some research on that, especially if you're limited on space and you want to make the most of your spring space and cover crops kind of doing both. All right, the next thing after planting, let's talk about tending, because there's still some tending jobs that need to be done in the fall. One thing that I recommend you start doing is if you've got broccoli, cabbage, any of your fall crops that you've had shade cloth on, I would recommend to start pulling back on that shade cloth so that these crops can get full sun. If you planted them in August, they're probably fairly well established, and I do this usually in stages, but start trying to get them in sun as quickly as you can. Even if it's hot, if they are being watered well and they are established, as in you have seen growth in these plants, they should be okay to start gradually bringing down the shade cloth. Also, if it's still hot, continue to keep on top of irrigation. I know every climate's different, but this is the time of year we typically don't get as much rain. And so irrigation is really important, especially on these new fall plants where their roots are still shallow. They haven't been able to go as deep as your established tomatoes are. And so you want to keep on top of consistent irrigation, carrots especially, making sure, just consider their roots are not very deep. So you want to make sure and irrigate more frequently. Now, as we head into the fall, and especially as the temperatures at night start to dip, as we start seeing a little bit more cool weather, you can start scaling back on the irrigation frequency. As these summer crops start to establish, you can scale back, because remember, as we get into cooler weather, what we're going to see is these crops are going to not be growing as fast. And so if they're not growing as fast, they're not going to need as much water. The temperature is cooler, so there's not going to be as much transpiration where the plants are losing water through their leaves like they're losing it like crazy in the middle of the summer. So you can scale back on the irrigation. You don't want to over irrigate them this time of year. Next, I know we're coming to the end of this, but continue staying on top of pests. This is a really big time in my area for cabbage worms. So keep those brassicas covered with insect netting, your broccoli, your cabbage, Brussels sprout, kale, anything like that. Keep them covered with netting. I usually keep mine covered until the first frost, just because that's usually they're active that whole time. But anything you can handpick, harlequin beetles, anything like that. Side note, this is something that I noticed this year. And I don't know if this is the case all the time, but I noticed about the middle to end of July, the bean beetles were gone. There's no way I picked all of them off, right? I was picking every day, but they were just gone. And so I'm not sure if this is just which I probably should do some more research on this. I'm not sure if that was just I would imagine it is their feeding cycle. And then the ones that are still there, they usually will drop. And anyway, there's a cycle there that they may be done. All that to say, the fall pests will be the same way. Scout for them, see what's there, see what's missing. This time of year, squash vine borer is missing. See, are squash bugs still present? Notice when the insects that are in your garden are at their peak, and notice when they start to be where you don't see them anymore, like what's missing. And this is helpful for you in the future years to be like, okay, if this is something that holds true where the middle to the end of July, I don't see bean beetles, then I know when I need to stay on top of them. And in my mind, I'll be like, okay, just hang on a little bit longer. So this is something that's really good for you to learn as a gardener, what these pest cycles might be in your garden. And then the final thing for tending is try to stay on top of weeding. I know that's really hard for me to say, but this is the time of year where they really start pumping out, hoping to get seeds and to drop seeds, because they know not know it, but the way that they grow, they're sensing that the season is coming short. So lots of plants are really ramping up seed production. And so what you want to do is you want to get these weeds out before seeds start to drop, because then you're going to have a bigger problem with weeds in the future if these weeds are allowed to develop seeds and drop. So try to stay on top of weeds as much as you can. I know that's not the most fun task, but I feel like I have to remind you of that just to be able to help for the future. As you can see, September is a busy month in the garden. For me, I am still transplanting some crops like lettuce. I'm refreshing raised beds and containers with new soil as these new crops are coming in. And I'm trying to help get everything established before the cooler weather rolls in. One thing I consistently use through it all is Organic Rev. Before any transplant goes into the ground, raised beds, or my green stalk, whether it's broccoli, cabbage, lettuce, or anything else, I dip that root ball in a 50-50 mix of Organic Rev and water. It helps to reduce transplant shock, and it gives those roots a boost when they need it most. And for my beds that just need a refresh after the summer crops, I will water Rev directly in the soil. It helps to reactivate the microbial life, it improves moisture retention, and it helps to unlock nutrients so my fall crops can grow stronger and get established faster. So whether you're tucking in greens, setting up for garlic, which we'll talk about in just a little bit, or giving your tired soil a boost, Rev is one of the easiest steps you can take to support a healthy fall garden. Head to organicrev.com and use code Jill10 and you can save 10% off of your order. Grab that bottle so you have it ready. Your fall crops and your soil will thank you. The next task is to stay on top of clearing out some plants from your garden. I know this is hard to do, but take out the plants that you're done with. These might be cucumbers, tomatoes, even peppers. If there's usually this time of year, I will have already taken out my banana peppers because I'm done with banana peppers. I've canned all that I want to, and they're just taking up space that I could plant lettuce in. Or maybe you have a cucumber plant that's just not looking great and it's not producing a whole lot. Take it out. If it's not doing you any good and all it's doing is it's serving to exacerbate disease, which is sometimes my issue with cucumbers, get it out. Tomatoes, if you've noticed that it's not producing anything, get it out. The point is this time of year, try to not hang on to things. Don't feel like you have to keep them if they're not producing for you, if they're not doing anything for you. Get them out. That way you have a fresh start, whether that's for your fall garden or whether that is just honestly to look out in your garden and see that it's not messy and frustrating. Because if I go out there and if I'm looking out there and I just see these tired plants, it does something to you mentally. But if you see like refreshed space, it really does help, especially as we go into the fall. Put some pansies in there. That brightens our day all the time when we see that. The next thing you can do is, especially if you have a frost date that we're still a couple months away from, like me, prune your tomato plants. When we're pruning them, this does stimulate new growth. And this time of year, photosynthesis is really important for tomatoes because we're getting less sunlight. So prune them so that you can stimulate more growth for more leaves. But also, if you are, well, it just depends on the tomato that you're growing, but consider starting to prune off tomato flowers if this applies to you. So let me explain to you why. By the time your tomato flower starts to produce to the time that you can expect the tomato to be ripe enough to harvest, you're looking at about a 4 to 8 weeks. 4 weeks probably more likely for a cherry tomato, a smaller tomato, 8 weeks for a larger tomato. These are on average. And so what you want to do is you want to ask, is there enough time for these to produce before frost? So for me, if my average first frost date is November 1st, the first part of September, or maybe the middle of September, I'm probably going to be wise to start to prune off tomato flowers because they're not going to be able to make a fruit before my frost anyway. Another thing to consider is that nighttime temperatures below 50 will dramatically slow or stop ripening. I think it was last year that I did a whole podcast episode on this, so I will put this in the show notes if you're interested in that. But that's really important to know as far as the ripening of your tomatoes, because what you can do is by snipping off these flowers, then the thought goes is that the plant will put its energy into ripening the fruit that's already there. So this is a good time to really consider how much of this tomato plant am I going to be able to get tomatoes from before winter sets in, before your first frost. Now, if you don't get frost, this is obviously not going to apply to you because you're in your heyday for tomatoes typically in the fall. But for those of us who do get a first frost and we're nearing it, this is a good time to think about that. The next thing is garlic. You will be planting around your first frost date. This is going to be, for most of us, the end of October, early November. For those of you guys in the deeper south, usually November is still an ideal time to plant garlic. And if you don't have seed garlic yet, get that ordered. A lot of places were starting to do pre-orders in July, but some sources may still have some to be able to order. So get those ordered. If you harvested garlic this year, then save those largest bulbs. I know those are the ones we want to use because they're the best, but save the largest ones and use those as seed garlic this year. All that to say, you want to be prepared for your garlic because it's going to be the last thing that goes in before you're into your season. The next thing is decide on how many. This is something that I don't think that I truly really took into consideration. I was just like, okay, got to plant garlic. But consider that each clove that you plant is going to develop a bulb. And if you grow softneck garlic, if you're more in the South, then that softneck garlic can realistically last you until the next garlic harvest if you store it well. So if you're able to have garlic last you a whole year, how many bulbs of garlic do you need in a year? A lot of people that I've talked to, they use one a week. Okay, easy enough. Plant about 50. But all that to say, decide how many you're going to plant and then where you're going to plant them. So this is the thing that's important to understand is that, yes, we plant garlic in the fall, but garlic is not going to harvest until most places around June. Some people will harvest in May if you're in the South, and then some won't harvest till July if you're in the North, but typically a good average is June. But consider that this space is going to be full of garlic to that point. I know that wherever I plant garlic, I am not going to be able to plant any spring crops because I'm not going to harvest it till June. So consider your space and if you need that space for spring crops. Also, I was talking to someone when I was helping plan their fall garden plan, and she wanted a lot of garlic, but she didn't have a lot of space. And she's like, actually, my spring space is more important. So we struck a good medium where she had enough garlic that she was happy with, but it didn't take up her whole garden because she wanted to have a spring garden, which is understandable and something you want to consider. As far as where to plant your garlic, this is pretty easy for me because you're planting these around your average first frost date. Your summer crops are going to be done. So you can consider, I usually plant mine after okra because I know okra is going to be done for sure by the first frost, but a lot of times it's, when the temperatures at night get to the 50s, they don't like it. So a lot of times I plant mine after okra, but you can also plant them after peppers or plant them after tomatoes, anything that's not going to last the winter, zucchini, squash. I mean, you have lots of different options because those crops are going to be out before you need to plant them anyway. So that's a tip to decide where you're going to plant your garlic. And then another thing that you can do is if you have the space that you know that you're going to plant garlic, start adding your compost now to start feeding that soil so that that is ready for you. If you have chickens, this is something that I like to do is about a month before I'm planting my garlic, I like to clean out the chicken coop and I like to add the pine shaving mixture with the manure to the top of the garlic or wherever I'm going to plant the garlic. And that gives it time to start breaking down and feeding the soil. I don't mix it in typically if it has the pine shavings because that's a lot of carbon and I want my garlic to have as much nitrogen as possible. But if it's naturally going to start to compost from the top down, I usually add it to the top and then I'll plant it. Finally, there are a few other things that you can do in September. Number one, we talked about insect netting, but let's talk about floating row cover because eventually if you want to extend your season, you want to have a floating row cover to be able to cover on those cold nights to be able to last a little bit longer. So make sure you have enough. If you don't have enough, then purchase that so it's ready to go. Same thing for hoops. If you need some hoops, if you need to make them or buy them, get them ready to go so it's easy to cover your crops when you need to. If you don't have a bottle of Organic Rev, go ahead and order that, have that ready for you. One thing that I've noticed with Rev is it really helps those plants when we have an early freeze or the first freeze. It definitely has helped my plants to be able to handle the cold. So that's something that I would recommend keeping on hand, and it's shelf stable so you can continue using it in the spring. And then if you have crops that you're still harvesting, then try to plan preserving days if you need a full day, making sure that you're making the most of the crops that you're harvesting. This is a time of year, especially going into September, October. My peppers are really pumping out, so I'm trying to get those frozen. Obviously, you have other crops. Maybe you still have green beans, getting those canned if you need some help for that. Remember, I have my Harvest to Kitchen course on sale, and today's the last day of the sale. You can get it anytime, but to get it for the discount, you can get it today. Again, journeywithjill.net/harvest to kitchen. So September is a fun month. It's a big month of transitions. October, I think, is my favorite one to garden in because, it's October, but we're setting ourselves up for a fantastic October, even November, December, depending on where you're at, by doing some of these things that we talked about today. So I hope that this has been helpful for you. Don't forget, if you want some help making sure you get a fall salad garden, don't forget that I have my fall salad garden calendar that you can download for free. We have that link in the show notes, so check that out. I hope you've enjoyed today, and I hope you have a great week. I hope you had a good Labor Day weekend for those in the U.S., and I will chat with you again next week.